While taking transformations and turning them back into original core patterns makes for simpler diagrams, things can get rather complicated when a sentence has gone under more than one transformation. I have not put really complex transformed sentences into your quizzes, or the coming quiz, or the future ones either, but it is possible to come across a sentence that is, for example, both a question and a passive, or a question and a negative, etc. To illustrate what to do with these, look at the sentence at the top of page 115. By whom was the state's prison reform movement initiated? This sentence is both a question and a passive. So just state both the transformations at the beginning, then diagram the core sentence. So here's our example. You state the two transformations. Oops, I keep doing that. The two transformations up at the top there, and then simply go and do your sentence, which goes back into the original core sentence as someone initiated the state's prison reform movement. And here's an example of how I've substituted in this case, an indefinite pronoun for the noun phrase slot that has the missing information for the WH question. I hope that makes sense after I explained it earlier. All right, then moving on to existential there sentences. We use these sentences all the time. They, like passive sentences, are often presented by writing teachers as weak and to be avoided because punchy prose usually wants to have people doing actions. But in our conversation, it is very common to use existential there sentences. You can, in many cases, use the transformational approach in analyzing these sentences, but not always. As in the example in the textbook on page 117 demonstrates, there may be a labor shortage in a few years cannot be changed to a labor shortage may be in a few years. Typically, though, it would work if you changed the be verb to exist. That is why, after all, we call them existential there sentences. They demonstrate a state of existence. If that makes sense. If you don't change the sentences back to core sentences, you'll have to make sure you label the expletive there as a grammatical subject and the noun phrase after the be verb as the logical subject. This is not treated in the book, but it is worth mentioning that in our language today, many speakers do not distinguish sentences of this kind as being singular or plural in nature. That's because they look only at the word there, which at the beginning, the expletive, instead of the logical subject, and just consider it singular. But if the logical subject is plural, like the examples on page 116, use are and not is. There are 3 examples in the book, not there is or theirs, which is what a lot of people do. And then in imperative sentences, you may have learned in grade school or high school that in imperative sentences, the subject you is understood. That's the word that they would use, understood. But we will proceed with the practice of saying that both you and will are understood. If you do, it is also easier to make the transformation back to the core sentence version. I don't like the way the imperative diagram looks. It's not consistent, really, because in the one in the book I'm talking about, because all sentences must have a noun phrase subject and a verb phrase predicate. That is just one of the fundamental rules of our sentences, that they have to have a noun phrase subject. But you can do the diagramming either way, really. This section is fairly self-explanatory, the section on compound structures, with constituents able to be conjoined or compounded by using conjunctions. But correlative conjunctions, for example, either or, they are clearly harder to recognize and more of a pain to diagram because the two words that make up the conjunction are separated in the sentence. A note about diagramming conjunctions. The diagram on page 121 shows the conjunction attaching to the noun phrase that comes after it. I've seen tree diagrams in a number of grammar books, and I've never seen it done this way. In fact, in the first editions of our book, Doing Grammar, our author didn't do this either, but somewhere along the line, he changed it. But this is how it's usually done. The conjunction has a separate branch off from the whatever the slot is that's being filled. If you have conjoined compound noun phrases here, the conjunction is in the middle and it gets a separate thing. But in the book, I don't know why that he has decided to do it in this way. So you can do it however way you want, but I refuse. I refuse to do it that way. Finally, there's a section on conjunctive adverbs at the end of the chapter. The only thing I'll say here about conjunctive adverbs is that if you don't know how to use them properly, they are likely the leading cause of comma splices in your writing or in your speaking. To look briefly at the three versions of the brand name cereal sentence on page 128, meaning brand name cereals are expensive, nonetheless they appeal to kids. You can conjoin sentences with a period, as we have here, and a new sentence. That's perfectly natural. And the new sentence beginning with that adverb, that conjunctive adverb, you can conjoin it with a semicolon in front of it, as we are here, or with a semicolon and putting the adverb later in the sentence, as in this example here, where nonetheless comes later in the second clause. You can't, however, conjoin the two parts with a comma and the adverb. Here's an example of that at the bottom here, the last example, and the asterisk there means that it's a non-grammatical sentence. So brand name cereals are expensive, comma, nonetheless they appeal to kids. You can do that with a conjunction like and or but not with a conjunctive adverb. This ungrammatical tendency might be encouraged by a misguided teacher who tells students to avoid using semicolons. And when this happens, it's probably because the teacher doesn't know how to use them properly either. The semicolon is a rather sophisticated piece of punctuation, but it is a very beautiful piece of punctuation and deserves to be used properly. If you think of that idea of there's a reason for putting these two separate sentences together, there's something that the second one does to answer it. So it's a distinction that's worthy of spending a little time with. Okay, so hopefully that will help you in your preparation for the quiz for Chapter 5, and then we will be back for the next chapter soon.